Richard Holloway didn't knock. He walked through the front door of the Whitmore farmhouse like he already owned it. Boots loud on the wood floor, hat still on his head. A folded paper held between two fingers like it was something dirty he didn't want to touch. Clara's father stood up from his chair. Her mother stepped back toward the wall. Holloway dropped the paper on the kitchen table. "Sign it," he said, "or I come back with the sheriff Monday morning and you'll be clearing your furniture out by noon." Clara looked at the paper. Then she looked at her father's hands, the way they trembled when he reached for it. He was 61 years old. He had worked this land since before she was born, and in that moment, he looked like a man who had already given up. That was the moment Clara's life ended, and the moment it truly began. If you've ever been handed a choice that wasn't really a choice at all, if you've ever signed something that broke your heart just to protect someone you love, then stay with me, because this is Clara's story, and it will stay with you long after it's over. Subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will surprise you in ways you won't see coming. Hit the like button and drop a comment right now telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Don't miss a single chapter, because the next ones are even more powerful than this. The paper sat on the kitchen table for 3 days before anyone touched it again. Clara knew what it was. She had read every word of it the night Holloway left, standing in the doorway of the kitchen after her parents had gone to bed, her finger tracing the lines in the lamplight like she could find a mistake somewhere, some loophole, some error in the language that would make it mean something different than what it said. There was no mistake. A marriage agreement between Clara Ann Whitmore, age 21, and James Robert Carter, age 34, of Carter Ranch, Red Willow County, Montana. In exchange for the settlement of all outstanding debts held by the Whitmore family, including the mortgage, the unpaid water lease, and the back taxes totaling 11 years, Clara would become James Carter's wife within 30 days of signing. 11 years. She hadn't known it was that bad. Her father had kept the numbers from her the way parents keep bad news from children, long past the age when children have a right to know. She folded the paper back the way Holloway had brought it and set it on the table and went to her room and sat on the edge of her bed and didn't cry. She was past crying. She had done that 2 years ago when the second drought hit and they lost the Southfield's entire yield, when her younger sister Lily couldn't go back to school because there was no money for the fees, when her mother started selling off pieces of her own mother's silver just to buy flour. Clara didn't cry because crying required some hope that things might be different, and she had spent most of that hope already. What she felt instead was something quieter and more frightening than sadness. She felt the future closing in around her like a gate swinging shut. She was 21 years old, and she was about to become a stranger's wife. Her father came to her room the following morning. He knocked twice, which he hadn't done since she was about 15, and she knew from that alone how much this was costing him. He sat down in the chair by her window, the one that had always been covered in her things: a shawl, a stack of books, the dried flowers from her friend May's wedding last spring. And he moved all of it carefully to the floor before he sat, like he was treating her belongings with more respect than usual, like maybe that would make up for something. "I need you to understand," he started. "I do understand," Clara said. "Clara, I understand, Papa." Her voice was flat, not angry, just worn through. "I just don't know how you let it get this far without telling me." George Whitmore was not a vain man, but he had his pride, and she watched it buckle now in front of her. He pressed his hands together between his knees and stared at the floor and didn't say anything for a long moment. "I kept thinking it would turn," he said finally. "I kept thinking, one good season, just one, and we'd get our footing back. We haven't had a good season in 4 years. I know that. And you never said us a word." "I know that too." He looked up. His eyes were red at the edges. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now. I'm asking you to save this family. And I'm asking you knowing full well what I'm asking and how wrong it is to ask it." Clara looked at her father, really looked at him, and saw what she had been too busy to notice over the last couple of years. He was old. Not just tired old. Old in the bones, old in the way a man gets when the fight has been going on too long. His shoulders were curved inward like they were trying to protect something that was already gone. She looked away. "What do you know about James Carter?" she asked. Her father shifted in his chair. "He's a fair man, from what I hear, keeps to himself, runs a clean operation." What do people say about him? There was a pause that told her everything. Papa? People say he's difficult, George said carefully. Cold, some say. Doesn't mix much with the town. Lost his father young and took over the ranch before he was ready. Some people respect him. Some people are just afraid of him, I suppose. Afraid of him, she repeated. Not because he's violent, he added quickly. Nothing like that, just he doesn't talk much, doesn't explain himself. People tend to fear what they can't read. Clara sat with that. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn a stone over to see what's underneath it, trying to decide whether what lived there was something you could live with. And he agreed to this, she said. He looked at a woman he'd never met, and he agreed to marry her. He did. Why? Her father opened his mouth and closed it again. I don't know, he admitted. That was the part that frightened her most. Not the marriage itself, not the leaving. It was the not knowing, the complete and total blankness of James Carter's reasons, like trying to read a letter written in a language she'd never learned. She told Lily that evening. Her sister was 17 and fierce in the way that younger sisters are fierce when they've grown up watching someone else carry the weight. A little righteous, a little guilty, furious in the way of someone who doesn't yet know they're partly helpless. You can't, Lily said. She was sitting on Clara's bed, arms crossed, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. Clara, you cannot do this. I already know that I can. That's not what I mean, and you know it. Clara kept folding clothes into her trunk. Methodical. One thing at a time. What would you have me do? Fight it. Talk to someone. There has to be another way. I've been through the accounts, Lily. There is no other way. She said it without drama, because drama would have made it easier to argue with. Facts were harder. We owe 11 years of back taxes, plus the mortgage, plus the water lease. Even if we sold the farm, it wouldn't cover half of it. This pays everything, all of it, clean. He's buying you. He's settling a debt. Clara, that's the same thing. Clara stopped folding. She held a blue shirtwaist in both hands and looked at it for a moment, then set it down carefully in the trunk. She didn't look at her sister. Maybe it is, she said quietly. But Mama and Papa stay on their land. You go back to school. We don't lose everything. That's not nothing, Lily. Lily made a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a curse word, and Clara almost smiled, because Lily had always been the one who felt things loudly and out in the open, and there had been times in Clara's life when she'd envied that terribly. What if he's awful? Lily whispered. Clara resumed folding. Then I'll survive him. What if he... I will survive him, Clara said again, and there was something in her voice that closed the subject. Not meanness, just the sound of a decision that had already been made, already calcified, already beyond the reach of hope or argument. She signed the paper the next morning. Her hand didn't shake. She had decided before she picked up the pen that her hand would not shake, and it did not. George Whitmore witnessed it with his own name beside hers, and when she pressed the pen back into his hand and looked at his face, she saw something she didn't expect. He looked ashamed. Good, said a small dark voice inside her. Let him feel that. She pushed the voice down because it wasn't useful, and she didn't have the luxury of carrying anger right now. She needed both hands free for everything that was coming. Richard Holloway collected the signed paper with the same energy he'd delivered it, brisk, barely acknowledging either of them, folding it into his coat like a receipt. He told her a wagon would come for her on Friday. Not James Carter. A wagon. Clara watched Holloway walk back down the porch steps and climb into his buggy and leave without looking back, and she thought, that man will matter again. She didn't know how she knew that, but she did. There was something about the way he handled that paper. Too proprietary, too satisfied, like it was something that served his interests more than James Carter's, that left a small, cold knot in her stomach. She filed the feeling away and went inside to finish packing. Bussing. Friday came the way. Fridays always come when you don't want them to. Too fast, and yet somehow also like it had been approaching forever. Her mother packed food for the journey. Biscuits wrapped in cloth. Dried apples. A small jar of the chokecherry preserves that Clara had always loved. Eleanor Whitmore was not a woman who said things plainly. She showed love through feeding people and fixing things. And so this jar of preserves pressed into Clara's hands at the door, was her mother's way of saying everything she couldn't put into words. Clara held it against her chest and let her mother hug her and did not fall apart. Her father shook her hand. She wished he had hugged her. She thought he wished that too. Lily held on too long and had to be gently detached. "Write to me," she said fiercely. "Every week. If you don't write, I'll come up there myself." "You won't," Clara said. "I will. I'll walk if I have to." "I'll write," Clara said, and she meant it. She meant it more than anything else she said that morning. The wagon was driven by a man named Holt, somewhere in his 50s, weathered down to the essentials, who introduced himself and then did not speak again for 6 miles, which Clara found she was grateful for. She had enough noise in her own head without having to manage someone else's conversation. Carter Ranch was about 18 miles north of Red Willow. The road climbed up into rougher country as they went. The kind of landscape that Montana keeps for people willing to work hard enough to reach it, where the hills got their teeth in and the sky seemed to widen rather than close in. In any other circumstance, she might have found it beautiful. She kept her back straight and her hands folded in her lap and watched the country pass and rehearsed, silently, every version of the first conversation she might have with James Carter. She imagined him cold. She imagined him looking her over the way you look over a purchase. She imagined him polite in the stiff, disinterested way of a man performing a duty, and she prepared herself for that, her chin up, her voice steady, her entire bearing communicating clearly, "I am not afraid of you, and I am not here to be dismissed." What she had not prepared herself for was what actually happened when the wagon came through the gate of Carter Ranch, and Holt pulled up in the yard, and she stepped down, and James Carter came out of the barn with his sleeves rolled up and mud on his boots, and the first thing he said to her was not a greeting at all. He said, "Don't let Holt take your trunk inside yet. There's a loose board on the front step. I've been meaning to fix it for a week and I haven't, and I don't want you to trip over it." Clara stood in the yard with the wind pulling at her hair and stared at him. He was taller than she'd expected, dark-haired, square-shouldered, with the kind of face that didn't tell you what it was thinking. Not cruel, not warm, just contained, like something had been built over it. He met her eyes for a moment, and then he looked at the step, as if checking that it was still broken, and then back at her. "I'll fix it today," he said. "Welcome to Carter Ranch, Miss Whitmore." He did not offer his hand. He did not smile. He turned around and went back into the barn. Clara stood there for a full 5 seconds. That was it. That was her welcome. A warning about a broken step and his back disappearing through a barn door. She picked up the small bag she'd carried herself and started toward the house and thought, carefully and deliberately, "All right, so this is what I'm working with, Pat." The house surprised her. She wasn't sure what she had expected. Something austere, maybe. Cold in the way a bachelor's house gets when no one has thought about it in years. She had braced herself for bare walls and dirty windows and the general sense of a space no one actually cared about. Instead, she found a house that was clean. Not decorated, not warm exactly, but tended. The floors were swept. The windows let in the afternoon light. There was wood stacked neatly by the fireplace, and on the kitchen table, someone had put out a cup and a small pot of coffee, and beside that, a plate covered with a cloth. She lifted the cloth. Biscuits. Fresh, still faintly warm. She stood in the kitchen of James Carter's house with a plate of biscuits in front of her that someone had made for her arrival, and she did not know what to do with that information. It didn't fit the version of James Carter she had constructed in her head, the version built out of whispers and her father's careful words, and the image of a man who sent wagons instead of coming himself. She set the cloth back down. She sat at the table. She poured herself the coffee. The house settled around her in the afternoon quiet, and somewhere outside she could hear the low sound of work continuing. Horses, the distant call of a man's voice, the ordinary noise of a ranch that didn't stop for anything. She drank her coffee and she thought, "I signed the paper. I'm here. Whatever this is, whatever he is, I'm going to figure it out." She had not come here to be saved by a kind man. She had not come here to fall in love. She had come here because her family needed her to, and she had done it with her eyes open, and she was not going to let herself be surprised or softened by a plate of biscuits and a warning about a broken step. She told herself that very firmly. She almost believed it. James Carter fixed the front step that afternoon. She heard the hammering from the kitchen where she was getting herself oriented, learning which cupboards held what, cataloging the pantry, finding the patterns in the household, the way she would have found them anywhere, methodically, practically, starting with what she could control. When the hammering stopped, she heard his boots on the step. 1, 2, testing it. Then silence. Then the boots continued on, and the door opened, and he came into the kitchen and stopped when he saw her standing at the counter. They looked at each other across the kitchen. "Steps fixed," he said. "I heard," she said. He nodded. He moved to the basin to wash his hands, and she watched him from the corner of her eye and waited, because she had the sense that James Carter didn't talk just to fill space, and that whatever he was going to say next had been considered before he said it. "I want to be clear about something," he said, reaching for the cloth to dry his hands. "All right," she said. He turned to face her. His expression was the same as it had been in the yard, contained, unreadable, but not unkind. More like a man who had learned not to show things before he was sure it was safe to. "The debt is paid," he said. "Your family's settled. That's done, and it's not something you owe me anything for. What I mean is—" He paused, and for just a moment something shifted in his face, something he seemed to catch and press back down. "You're not here as a debt. You can leave whenever you want. I won't stop you, and I won't take anything back. The agreement was to settle what your family owed. That part's finished." Clara stared at him. In all the versions of this conversation she had rehearsed on the wagon ride, this was not one of them. "You married me," she said carefully, "and you're telling me I can leave. I'm telling you that you're not a prisoner." He hung the cloth back on its hook, precise about it. "If you want to stay and make something of this, if you want to work this ranch and build a life here, I'd welcome that. I won't lie to you about that, but I won't hold a piece of paper over your head like a leash." The word landed in the room between them and stayed there. Clara thought of Holloway dropping that paper on her father's table. She thought of the 11 years her father had kept from her. She thought of her own hand, steady, signing her name. "Why did you agree to this?" she asked. James was quiet for a moment. Then, "Because the deal was fair. Your family's land is good land, and your father's an honest man who had bad luck for a long time. And because—" He stopped again. "Because why?" He looked at her directly for the first time since she'd arrived, not evaluating her, just looking, like he was deciding how honest to be. "Because I've been running this ranch alone for 10 years, he said, "and I'm tired." It was perhaps the most unguarded thing she had ever heard a man say in her life. She had expected pride or practicality or some calculated reason that would make sense in terms of land and money. She had not expected the truth. Not like that, plain and a little raw, offered up without any decoration. She didn't know what to say. "I'll stay," she said finally. "For now." James Carter nodded once, like that was settled, and he moved past her to the door, and then he stopped with his hand on the frame. "There's a ledger on the desk in the back room," he said, without turning around. "Ranch accounts. If you want to look at them, go ahead. I'm not keeping anything from you." He walked out. The door didn't slam. It closed quietly, the way careful people close doors, like they've learned to take up as little space as possible. Clara stood alone in the kitchen of Carter Ranch. She thought about what he'd said. The ledger on the desk. Not keeping anything from you. She thought about her father, who had kept 11 years of failure folded up in his coat pocket rather than let her help carry it. She was in a stranger's house, married to a man she didn't know, 300 miles from everything she'd ever loved. And she had just been given more honesty than she'd been given in the past 4 years at home. She dried her hands on her apron, which she had packed herself, which she had hung on the hook beside the kitchen door, because some habits are how you survive. And she went to find the ledger. The ledger was worse than she expected. Not catastrophically worse. Carter Ranch wasn't bleeding out the way the Whitmore farm had been. But the numbers told a story that a careful eye could read between the lines. And Clara had always had a careful eye. She sat at the desk in the back room with the lamp pulled close and went through the columns slowly, the way her school teacher had once taught her to read a page she didn't fully understand. Don't rush, don't skip, let the meaning come to you. What came to her after about an hour was this. Carter Ranch was surviving, but only just. And it had been only just for long enough that the margin had gotten dangerously thin. The cattle numbers were good, the land was good. But there were payments going out every quarter that didn't match the income, and when she tracked them back, she found entries listed simply as community assistance. Vague enough to mean anything, frequent enough to add up to something significant. Whoever was keeping this ledger had been meticulous about recording everything except the reason for those particular payments. She closed the book and sat in the quiet of the back room and thought about that. Then she went to bed, because it was late and she was exhausted in the way that comes not from physical work, but from a day that has required you to hold yourself together for too many hours in a row. She found the room that had been prepared for her. Small, clean, a quilt on the bed that had clearly been washed recently, a candle on the nightstand, and she lay down without unpacking anything else and stared at the ceiling. Across the hall, she could hear nothing. Not a sound from James Carter's room. Either he was already asleep or he was as quiet in private as he was in company, and she suspected the latter. She thought about what he had said in the kitchen. "I've been running this ranch alone for 10 years and I'm tired." She thought about the ledger. Community assistance. She thought about a man who let his margin shrink quietly, season after season, paying out to unnamed recipients, recording it faithfully, never explaining it to anyone. She thought, "I don't know you at all, but you are not what I thought you were." That was both better and more complicated than she'd been prepared for. She slept badly and woke before the sun. The first week at Carter Ranch was an education in how much she didn't know. She knew farming, she knew the rhythms of a working household, the management of a kitchen and a garden, and the 1,000 small tasks that hold a place together. What she didn't know was ranching, the specific, unforgiving logic of cattle, the way weather worked differently at this elevation, the personalities of the hands who worked here, and the invisible hierarchy among them that she would have to learn to navigate. There were 4 hands besides Holt, a young man named Dex, who couldn't have been more than 20 and seemed to vibrate with nervous energy at all times, 2 brothers, Cal and Pete Reardon, who communicated primarily with each other in a shorthand that excluded most other people, and a man named Silas, who was somewhere in his 60s and seemed to have the actual institutional memory of the ranch, the kind of man who knew where every fence post had been replaced, and why and in what year. Silas was the one who talked to her first, on her second morning, when she came out to the yard with coffee for everyone and held it out to him without saying anything. He looked at the cup, looked at her, and took it. "You're braver than I expected," he said. "Why's that?" she asked. "Most people who come out here looking like you do." He stopped, seemed to reconsider his phrasing. "Looking like they came from somewhere else," he amended. "They usually spend the first week waiting to go back." "I'm not going back," she said. He studied her over the rim of the cup. "No," he said after a moment. "I don't think you are." That was the closest thing to acceptance she got in that first week, and she decided it was enough to work with. James Carter watched her without appearing to watch her, which she noticed because she was doing the same thing to him. He was up before anyone else, every morning, already in the barn when the sky was still the color of old pewter. He worked with a consistency that wasn't driven by urgency. It was just the baseline, just the speed at which he operated, like the idea of stopping had never fully occurred to him. He didn't give unnecessary orders. He didn't raise his voice. When something went wrong, and on a working ranch something was always going wrong, he looked at it, assessed it, and dealt with it, and then moved on without the extended post-mortem that some men like to conduct as a display of authority. She watched him one morning with a horse that had come up lame, a young bay mare that was clearly in pain and also frightened, which made her dangerous in the way that pain and fear together always make something dangerous. 2 of the hands were keeping their distance. James went in close, slow, talking to the horse in a voice too low for Clara to hear from where she stood in the yard. He didn't rush it. He didn't grab. He just stayed there, patient and still, until the mare settled enough for him to run his hands down her leg and find the stone that had worked up into her shoe. It took 20 minutes. He could have done it in 5 with ropes and force. He chose 20. Clara went back into the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment and did not examine what she felt, because she had decided very firmly not to feel things about James Carter until she had more information, and one instance of patience with a horse was not enough information. She started breakfast. The accounts were what finally gave her a reason to have a real conversation with him. She had been going through them every evening, cross-referencing the ledger with the receipts she found in the desk drawer, and a second older book that she suspected no one had opened in 2 or 3 years. By the end of the first week, she had a clear picture of the operation. Clearer, she suspected, than James had in a while. because the kind of man who kept his own ledger tended to be inside the numbers too closely to see their shape from the outside. She left her notes on the kitchen table on a Friday evening and waited to see if he would look at them. He came in from the barn at the usual time, washed his hands, and sat down at the table. He looked at the notes. He picked them up. She poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of him without being asked and sat down across from him and waited. He read through everything. It took about 10 minutes, which told her he was reading carefully and not just scanning. When he finished, he set the pages down and looked at her. "You found the Hendersons," he said. She hadn't known what name to put to community assistance. Now she did. "Who are the Hendersons?" "Family about 6 miles east, widow with 4 kids. Her husband worked for me before he died. Fall from a horse 3 years ago." He said it plainly, without staging it for sympathy. Just information, delivered as fact. "I've been covering some of their costs since then. Not all of it. Enough." "And the quarterly payment to the post office address in Red Willow?" Something shifted in his face. Minute, almost imperceptible, but she was watching for it. "That's a school fund, for kids in the county whose families can't pay the fees." Clara set down her coffee cup. She thought about Lily, who had not been able to go back to school because there was no money for the fees. She thought about what it would have meant to her family if someone, somewhere, had been quietly making those payments. "How long?" she said. "The school fund? 6 years. And nobody knows it's you." "Doesn't need to be known." She looked at this man across the kitchen table, this man the town called cold, called difficult, called impossible to read. And she thought about the story people had built around him out of his silence, and how completely wrong it was, and how he had never bothered to correct it. "Your margin is thin because of these payments," she said, pulling herself back to the practical because the practical was what she was here for. "Not critically, but if you have one bad season, or if the water lease goes up, or if you lose 2 or 3 head to illness, I know. You could restructure this. Move some of the cash payments to a line of credit so the ranch account has more buffer. Keep the support going, just change the mechanism." He was quiet for a moment, then, "You have the details on that?" "I made some notes on the second page." He turned to the second page. He read it. He looked up at her, and there was something in his expression that wasn't quite surprise but was adjacent to it, the look of a man who had not expected to be genuinely helped. "All right," he said. "All right, you'll think about it, or all right, you'll do it." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. More like the suggestion of one, the possibility of one, held carefully in check. "Both," he said. She wrote to Lily that weekend. She sat at the little desk in her room on a Sunday afternoon and tried to figure out how to describe Carter Ranch to her sister without either alarming her or being dishonest, and discovered that the truth was harder to explain than she'd expected. Not because it was bad, but because it was complicated in ways that didn't translate easily into a letter. She wrote, "The ranch is a working place, and James Carter is a working man. He is not what I expected. I cannot yet tell you if that is better or worse, only that it is different." She crossed that out and wrote, "I am well. The house is clean and the food is adequate and the people here are not unkind. I have found useful work to do, which helps." She crossed that out too because Lily would read "useful work to do, which helps," and know immediately that Clara was managing her feelings by staying busy, which was true, but was too much to explain in a letter. She settled finally on, "I am all right, Lily. I promise I'm all right. Tell Mama the preserves were delicious, and I've been thinking about her every day. Tell Papa the farm was worth it." She didn't know yet if the last part was true, but she wanted it to be, and sometimes that was how you made things true. You said them out loud, or on paper, until they became real enough to believe. The trouble with Holloway arrived in her 3rd week, and it arrived the way Holloway himself arrived, without warning, without courtesy, in the middle of a working day when no one had invited him. Clara was in the yard when his buggy came through the gate, and she recognized him before he climbed down. That same proprietary quality to his movement, that same sense of a man who has decided in advance that every space belongs to him. He stopped when he saw her, took her in with a quick, assessing look that reminded her of the way certain men look at property they're considering purchasing, and she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. "Mrs. Carter," he said, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I'd heard you'd settled in." "Mr. Holloway." She didn't offer her hand. She didn't move back. She had learned that lesson from her father's kitchen. The moment you give ground to a man like this, he marks it and builds on it. James isn't here. He's on the south pasture. That's all right. It's a social call. He glanced around the yard with the particular gaze of a man who is not actually being social at all. Wanted to see how the newlyweds were getting on. We're getting on fine, Clara said. Thank you for asking. He smiled again. You know, your father was a good man to work with, easy to reach an agreement with when it came down to it. Something in the way he said it, the emphasis on easy, the slight pause before agreement, made that cold knot tighten again in her stomach, the same one she'd felt watching him fold that paper into his coat. I'm sure he was, she said carefully. Carter's lucky to have someone with your family's flexibility, Holloway said. That quality runs in families, I've found. She looked at him directly. Is there something specific you needed from Carter Ranch today, Mr. Holloway? He held her gaze for a moment, and she could see him deciding something behind his eyes, running some internal calculation. Then he looked past her towards the south, toward the line where Carterland ran up against the valley. Just looking, he said pleasantly. Just looking. He climbed back into his buggy and left. Clara stood in the yard for a long moment after the dust settled. Then she went to find Silas. What does Holloway want with the south pasture? She asked him. Silas stopped what he was doing. He looked at her with the slow, deliberate attention he gave to things that mattered. Where did you hear that? I didn't hear it. I'm inferring it. He just came by for a social call and spent most of it looking south. Silas leaned on the fence post. The south pasture runs along Ridge Creek. Ridge Creek is the only reliable water source in this part of the valley. Controls the creek. Controls which ranches can sustain themselves through a dry summer. And Carter Ranch controls the creek. The southern edge of Carter Ranch does, yes. James's father bought that parcel specifically because of the water. Holloway's been trying to get his hands on it for 12 years. Before James, he tried with James's father, never managed it. Clara thought about this. What happens if Holloway gets the water rights? Silas looked at her steadily. Every small ranch in the valley is at his mercy. He sets the terms. He sets the price. Anyone who can't pay, or anyone he doesn't like, dries up within a season or two. Including Carter Ranch? If he gets the water source, Carter Ranch doesn't exist in 5 years, not the way it is now. She thought about the ledger, the Henderson family, the school fund, the quiet ongoing care of a man who didn't talk about what he did, just did it, and had been doing it for years. Does James know Holloway's still pushing on this? She asked. James knows, Silas said. He doesn't know how far Holloway is willing to go. None of us do. She told James that evening. She waited until after supper, when the house had settled, and they were in the kitchen. The kitchen had become, without any discussion or plan, the place where they talked, where whatever small exchange of information their daily life required actually happened. It was practical, Clara told herself. The kitchen was the center of the house. There was nothing more to it than that. She described Holloway's visit. She described what he'd said and how he'd looked at the south, and she described what Silas had told her. She gave it to him plainly, in order, without editorializing. James listened with his arms folded and his eyes on the table. When she finished, he was quiet. He's been doing this longer than you've been alive, he said finally. Silas told me. 12 years. 13, James corrected. He started when my father got sick and thought we might have to sell. We didn't sell. And I've been a harder negotiation than my father was. He paused. That doesn't mean he stopped thinking about it. It just means he's changed tactics. What do you think his current tactic is? She asked. James looked up at her. There was something in his expression, not quite worry, but the specific alertness of a man who has been watching something approach for a long time and is now watching it get close. I think, he said slowly, he's been waiting for a weakness, something he can use to challenge my position here. The deed, the water rights, anything with a legal angle. He paused again. I think the marriage agreement might be something he's looking at. Clara felt the room shift slightly under her. Why? Because it was brokered through him, James said. He met her eyes, and for the first time she saw something in his that wasn't carefully contained, something honest and uncomfortable and a little raw. I should have told you that earlier. I didn't know Holloway well when I agreed to use him to approach your family. I thought he was just a middleman, someone who knew your father. By the time I understood what he was, the arrangement was already in place. The silence between them was significant. He brokered our marriage, Clara said. Yes. And now he has a copy of the agreement. Yes. What does he gain from that? James pressed his hands flat on the table. If he can claim the agreement was coerced, if he can make a case that you were trapped, that your family was pressured, he can challenge my character in a county hearing, challenge my fitness to hold the water rights. It's a thin case, but Holloway's good at thin cases. He uses them to create enough noise that people start to doubt. Clara sat with this for a long moment. She thought about her father's trembling hands. She thought about signing her name while Holloway watched. She thought about how it would look to a county council, a young woman whose family was in debt, married off in 30 days to a man they'd never met. It would look like what he says it was, she said quietly. It might. Even though you told me I could leave. I told you that in this kitchen. There are no witnesses to that conversation. He said it without accusation, just fact. But she heard what lived underneath it, the particular helplessness of a man who had tried to do something decent and couldn't prove it. She looked at James Carter across the kitchen table and she thought, you made a decision you can't defend. You did the right thing and left no evidence of it. And now someone who has been circling you for 13 years is about to use your one moment of genuine honesty to try to destroy you. Then we need to find evidence, she said. He looked at her. What kind of evidence? The kind that shows who you actually are. Not just on paper, the Hendersons, the school fund, the people in this valley who know you, who've been helped by you, who can speak to what kind of man you are when nobody's watching. She leaned forward slightly. Holloway's building a picture of you as someone who would trap a desperate woman. We need to build a different picture, a true one. James was quiet for a long moment. You'd do that? He said. You'd stand up and defend this marriage? I'd stand up and tell the truth, she said. That's different from defending it. The truth is that you told me I was free to leave. The truth is that you haven't treated me like a possession for a single day since I arrived. The truth is... She stopped herself, pulled back, steadied. The truth is complicated enough that it's worth saying out loud. He looked at her for a moment with that same expression she'd seen the day he'd admitted he was tired, unguarded, briefly, in the way of someone who doesn't do it often enough to be practiced at it. Clara, he said. It was the first time he had used her first name without the miss in front of it. She noticed. She thought he noticed that she noticed. I'm not going to pretend this arrangement is normal, he said. I'm not going to pretend you signed that paper because you wanted to be here. I know why you're here, and it's not because of me. It wasn't, she said. No, but I'm still here, and that part is starting to be a different thing. She hadn't entirely meant to say that. It came out ahead of the part of her brain that was managing things, the part that had been carefully keeping her feelings in their proper containers, labeled and stored, not spilling over into anything she couldn't control. James looked at her. Something in his face changed, not opened exactly, but shifted, like a window that's been painted shut for so long that when it finally moves, it surprises even the person who pushed it. All right, he said. All right, she said back. Neither of them said anything more that night, but something had moved, the way that stone under the creek moves when the water's been at it long enough. Not visibly, not dramatically, just a small, irreversible shift in position. She met May Reardon for the first time at the general store in Red Willow 4 days later, which was when she discovered that Silas and the Reardon brothers were not only employed by Carter Ranch, but were, in the loose way of small communities, extended family to half the valley. May was Cal Reardon's wife, a broad-shouldered, dark-eyed woman of about 35 who had the specific quality of someone who said exactly what she thought and had long since stopped apologizing for it. She looked Clara over in the street outside the store with frank, open assessment that Clara found more comfortable than the polite pretending most people did. You're smaller than I expected, May said. People keep expecting something different, Clara said. May laughed, a real laugh, short and unself-conscious. I like you already. Come inside, I'll show you which flower's worth buying and which one Garrett's been trying to get rid of for 6 months. In the store, while they moved through the aisles, May talked in the easy way of someone who has never lacked for opinions. She talked about the valley, about the year the East Creek ran dry and what it had done to the Pollard family, about the way winters worked up here versus down south. She talked about Carter Ranch with the casual familiarity of someone who had been inside its business for years. James has been better since you came, she said, somewhere around the dried goods. Clara looked at her. You can tell that already? I've been here 3 weeks. I've known James Carter for 10 years, May said, lifting a sack of cornmeal and evaluating it. He came to my wedding, stood in the back, left before the dancing started, but he came. That's his version of celebrating. She set the cornmeal down and looked at Clara directly. He's been not unhappy, exactly, but like a man who's removed himself from something and isn't quite sure why anymore. You follow? I think so, Clara said. The fact that you found the accounts in the first week and went through them instead of leaving them to him. The hands know about that. Silas told Cal told Pete told half the county, because Pete cannot hold information, it's his defining characteristic. May shook her head. The point is, they respect you. These are men who have been following James Carter for years. That's not nothing. Clara absorbed this. May, she said, what do you know about Richard Holloway? May's expression, which had been open and easy, changed. Not dramatically, just a careful setting down like she was putting something fragile on a shelf. I know he's been a problem for this valley for a long time, she said. What kind of problem? The kind that moves slow and smiles nice and doesn't leave fingerprints. May looked at her. What's he done? I don't know yet what he's planning, but I know he brokered our marriage and I know he's been looking at the south pasture. May was quiet. Then, he's never given up on that water source. Most people think he moved on. He didn't. He's patient. That's the scariest thing about him. He is very, very patient. Clara thought of Holloway in the yard. Just looking, he had said. Just looking. He's going to try to use the marriage agreement against James, Clara said. Can he? He can try. She picked up a jar of preserves, choke cherry, same as her mother made, and the similarity hit her somewhere soft and undefended, and set it in her basket. But I don't plan to let him get very far. May looked at her for a long moment. Then she smiled. Not the polite small-town smile Clara had been getting from people in Red Willow, but a real one, the kind that reached the eyes. James Carter, May said slowly, has no idea what he actually got when he sent that wagon. Clara didn't answer that, but she thought about it all the way home, the jar of choke cherry preserves sitting in her basket, and she thought about what May had said, and she thought about James with the horse, and James at the kitchen table, and James saying, I've been running this ranch alone for 10 years and I'm tired. And she thought that maybe, just maybe, neither of them had any idea what they'd gotten. She pulled up the collar of her coat against the October wind and drove the wagon home to Carter Ranch. And for the first time since she'd signed that paper on her father's kitchen table, the word home didn't feel like a word she was just using to mean the place where she was currently living. It felt like it meant something. She wasn't ready to look at that directly yet, but she let it sit in the corner of her mind, the way you let a fire build from a small thing, carefully, without rushing it, giving it only as much air as it needed to stay alive. The fire she had let build quietly in the corner of her mind did not stay quiet for long. October moved into November the way it does in Montana Hill Country. Not gradually, not with any courtesy of transition, but with a hard, decisive shift that you felt first in the ground and then in your bones. The mornings got their teeth in. The sky lost its blue and went to the gray-white of old tin. The hands worked faster and talked less, the way working people do when the season is pressing in, and there's a list of tasks that only gets longer if you stop to discuss it. Clara worked alongside all of it. She had found her rhythm by now, the accounts in the evenings, the household in the mornings, and in between, whatever the ranch needed that no one else was already doing. She had taken over the ordering from Red Willow without being asked, because she had looked at what was being ordered and seen 3 places immediately where they were paying more than they needed to. She had reorganized the pantry and the equipment shed, not because anyone told her to, but because the disorganization was costing time and time on a ranch in November was not something you could afford to waste. Nobody objected. Nobody questioned her. Silas helped when she asked. Dex was so eager to be useful that she had to actively assign him tasks to keep him from hovering. The Reardon brothers accepted her presence in the way that people accept weather, as a condition of existence that doesn't require comment. And James watched, the way he always watched, without appearing to. She caught him at it once. She was in the yard talking to Silas about the water trough near the south fence, and she turned her head at the wrong angle and found James standing near the barn door with his eyes on her. Not evaluating, not calculating, something else, something she didn't have a word for yet, and chose not to look for one, and turned deliberately back to Silas and the conversation about the trough. That evening at supper, James told her the Henderson family's oldest boy had started school. She looked up from her plate. "The restructure you suggested," he said, "with the line of credit. I talked to Marcus Webb in town. He thinks it's workable, means I can keep the support payments consistent without drawing down the operating account." He said it the same way he said everything, plain, factual, just information being transferred, but he looked at her when he said it, and she thought he was telling her more than the surface of what the words contained. "Good," she said. "The Henderson boy's name is Thomas," James said. "He's 8. He's apparently very good at arithmetic." Clara looked at her plate. She thought of Lily, who had been 17 and bright and furious at the world when opportunity was taken from her. She thought of an 8-year-old named Thomas, who was good at arithmetic and was now sitting at a school desk because of a line item change in a ranch ledger. "That's good," she said again, because it was all she trusted herself to say. The surveyors came on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November. Clara saw them from the kitchen window first. 2 men she didn't recognize, on foot, moving along the south fence line with equipment she recognized as surveying tools. They were on Carter land, not at the edge of it, not near the boundary. They were inside the fence, halfway across the south field, moving deliberately in the direction of the creek. She put down the dish she was holding. She did not go find James. She did not go find Silas. She pulled on her coat and her boots, and she walked out to the south field herself. And she walked fast because she had learned in the past month that the space between a problem and action was where most things were lost. The 2 men looked up when she got within 50 yards. They had the specific look of people who had been expecting not to be interrupted. Slightly startled, slightly annoyed, quickly reassembling their expressions into something neutral. "Morning," the taller one said. He had a red beard and the kind of professional pleasantness that some men use the same way other men use a locked door. "You're on Carter Ranch land," Clara said. She stopped about 10 feet from them and did not adjust her tone or her posture to make them comfortable. "This fence line is the legal boundary. You're 40 yards inside it." "We're conducting a survey for who?" she said. The man hesitated. The hesitation told her everything. "We were engaged to do a general land survey in this area," he said. "By who?" she said again. Not a question, a requirement. "Ma'am, we have authorization. Show it to me." Another hesitation, longer this time. The second man, who had not spoken, looked at the first man with the look of someone who is silently saying, "I told you this was a bad idea." "Show me the authorization or leave this land," Clara said. "Those are the 2 options. You can choose either one, but you need to choose in the next 30 seconds, because after that, I'm going to assume you're trespassing and I'm going to handle it accordingly." She had no specific plan for what accordingly meant. She had her voice and her bearing, and the reasonable bet that these 2 men were hired hands who had been sent out here by someone who hadn't considered that they might meet someone willing to push back. The taller man lowered his equipment. "We'll come back with the paperwork," he said. "You do that," Clara said. "And when you come back, come to the front gate and ask permission, the same way people do when the land they want to enter belongs to someone else." They left. She watched them all the way to the fence line, and then watched them climb through and get to their horses and ride west, which was the direction of Holloway's land. She stood in the south field for a moment by herself, her breath clouding in the cold air, and she thought, there it is. There's the opening move. James was in the barn when she found him. She told him what had happened, same as she'd told him things before, in order, with detail, without alarm. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through it. "He's looking for a surveying error," James said, "or trying to manufacture one. If he can establish that the boundary line was placed incorrectly at any point in the property's history, he can challenge the deed in court." "Is there any chance the boundary is wrong?" "No, my father had it surveyed twice. The documentation is solid." He paused. "Doesn't mean Holloway can't create noise with a competing survey. Enough noise to get a hearing. Enough noise to give the county council a reason to freeze the water rights while it's adjudicated." "How long would a freeze last?" "Months, maybe through summer." He looked at her. "Through a dry summer without water rights, I can't sustain the cattle numbers we need. I'd have to sell off half the herd at a loss. It would take years to recover from that, if we recovered at all." Clara thought about this. So the survey is a delay tactic. He doesn't expect to win on the boundary question. He just needs it to take long enough. "That's my read," James said. Then we need to move faster than he does, she said. Get to Marcus Webb before Holloway files anything. Get our documentation in front of the council first, so any challenge he makes looks like what it is. A bad faith claim from someone who's been trying to get this land for 13 years. James looked at her. You want to go on offense? I want to go on truth, she said, which in this case happens to be the same thing. Something moved across his face. That shift she'd seen before. The window that surprised itself by opening. He looked at her for a long moment in the dimness of the barn, and she held the look without backing away from it. I'll ride into Red Willow tomorrow, he said. Talk to Webb. I'll come with you, she said. I've been through the water rights documentation. I know where the strongest sections are. He nodded. All right. It was 2 words. But there was something in them, a collaboration, a genuine one, between 2 people who had started out as strangers, and a piece of paper and had become, without quite meaning to, something harder to name and considerably harder to walk away from. Well, Marcus Webb had an office above the Red Willow dry goods store that smelled permanently of old paper and wood smoke, and he was the kind of lawyer who looked like he'd been practicing since before most of the valley's residents were born, which was approximately accurate. He was in his 60s, sharp-eyed behind wire-rimmed glasses, with the careful listening quality of someone who has learned that the most important thing a client says is usually the thing they almost don't say. He listened to James. He listened to Clara's account of the surveyors. He read the boundary documentation she had brought without commenting until he reached the 3rd page, at which point he made a small sound that might have been satisfaction. Your father was thorough, he said. He was, James said. The 1887 survey and the subsequent 1901 confirmation are both in here, both with county witness signatures. Webb set the papers down. Holloway can file a competing survey, but he'd need to find a surveyor willing to contradict 2 prior official records with county verification. That's not impossible, but it's expensive and it's risky for whoever he hires. He looked at James. More likely he's fishing, seeing whether the documentation is airtight or whether there's a loose thread somewhere he can pull. There isn't, Clara said. Webb looked at her. You've been through all of it? Yes? Including the water lease amendment from 1903? The one that establishes the right of use for the creek tributary through the south pasture, yes. Webb regarded her for a moment over his glasses with an expression she'd seen a few times in her life from men of a certain generation. Not exactly surprise, but the calibration of someone adjusting an assumption they hadn't known they were making. Then he looked back at his papers. I'll file a preemptive documentation review with the county, he said. Gets our records on the official docket before anything Holloway presents. Makes any challenge look reactive. He paused. That said, the water rights aren't the only thing I'd be watching. James leaned forward slightly. What else? Webb took off his glasses and set them on the desk. There's a man in Red Willow, name of Garrett, runs the dry goods store downstairs. He came to me last week with a question about a document he'd been asked to notarize. He said it carefully, like a man laying down something fragile. He declined to tell me the full details, but the nature of the question suggested someone was putting together a legal statement of some kind about circumstances being not fully voluntary. The silence in the room went very still. Clara felt it first in her chest, then in her hands. He's building the coercion case, she said. It appears that way, Webb said. I don't have details. Garrett is cautious, but he came to me, which suggests he was uncomfortable with what he was being asked to do. James's jaw had tightened. He was looking at the desk, not at either of them, and Clara recognized the expression, not anger exactly, but the particular set of a man's face when he is containing something that would do damage if he let it out. He's going to use the marriage, James said. Almost certainly, Webb said. The question is what his evidence looks like and whether he can find a willing notary or a cooperative witness. He looked at Clara. Mrs. Carter, forgive the directness, but the strongest counter to a coercion claim is a straightforward account from you about the nature of your decision, the circumstances of your family and the voluntary nature of your agreement. I can do that, Clara said. It may not be a private account, Webb said. If he files with the county council, it could require a public statement. I can do that, she said again. James turned his head and looked at her. She met his eyes. There was something there she hadn't seen in him before. Not quite vulnerability, but its close neighbor. The look of a man who has been fighting alone for so long that being defended by someone else was a thing he didn't know what to do with yet. She held his gaze long enough to let him know she meant it. Then she looked back at Webb. "What do we do first?" she asked. "Oh, what they did first was talk to Garrett. He was behind the counter downstairs when they came down from Webb's office, a compact, careful man of about 50, who looked up when the door opened and then looked down again with the slightly increased focus of someone who has been expecting an uncomfortable conversation and is now having it. James introduced himself and Clara. Garrett shook hands. He did not offer them coffee. "I assume Webb told you I came to see him," Garrett said. "He mentioned it," James said. "We're not here to put you in a difficult position." "You're already in one," Garrett said plainly. He folded his hands on the counter. "I was approached 3 weeks ago by a man who works for Holloway. Not Holloway himself. A man named Ferris who does his legal footwork. He wanted me to notarize a statement." "What kind of statement?" Clara asked. Garrett looked at her directly. He had the decency not to look away. "A statement that your father had signed indicating that you were not a willing party to the marriage agreement, that it had been represented to him as a different kind of arrangement, and that he had not fully understood what he was agreeing to on your behalf." Clara felt the room tilt slightly. Her father. They had gone to her father. "Did he sign it?" she said. Her voice came out steady. She was proud of that. "I don't know," Garrett said. "I declined to notarize anything connected to that situation because I didn't have enough information to verify the statement's accuracy, and because Ferris couldn't answer basic questions I had about the surrounding circumstances." He paused. "I'm telling you this because I think you should know, not because I'm taking sides." "We understand," James said, "and we appreciate it." Clara said nothing. She was still working through the image of her father, tired, ashamed, still carrying the weight of what he'd asked her to do. Being approached by a man named Ferris, who would have sat across from him with a piece of paper and explained exactly how to put it, exactly how to make it sound like what Holloway needed it to sound like. Her father, who trusted people because his whole life had been built on a kind of faith that turned out to be expensive. Her father, who had spent 11 years keeping things from her because he couldn't bear for her to see how badly he'd failed. She thought, he might have signed it, not out of malice, out of guilt, out of a man's inability to understand that trying to undo one mistake by making another was not the same as fixing anything. She thought, I have to get to him before Holloway does again. Well, she wrote the letter that night. Not the letter she sent to Lily every week. This was a different kind of letter, longer and more careful, without the managed distance she'd maintained in the others. She wrote to her father. She told him what she knew about Ferris and the statement. She told him plainly what it would mean if that statement was used. Not to frighten him, but because George Whitmore was a man who needed facts, who could only be reached through specifics, because the abstractions always let him talk himself into believing what was easier. She told him the truth about Carter Ranch. Not everything, she wasn't ready for that, but enough. She told him James had offered her freedom on the first day. She told him about the Henderson family and the school fund. She told him that the man Red Willow thought it knew and the man who lived here were not the same man, and that she needed her father to know that before anyone else got to him with a different story. She wrote, I am not asking you to protect me. I'm asking you to be honest, because that is the one thing that has always been yours to give, and it matters now more than it ever has. She folded the letter and addressed it and set it by the door to go out with the morning post, and then she sat in the kitchen in the dark for a while because the letter had cost her something, and she needed a minute to sit with that. She heard James on the stairs. Not coming down, just moving, the particular tread of a man who can't sleep and is trying to be quiet about it. She heard him stop at the bottom of the stairs. There was a long pause. Then he appeared in the kitchen doorway. He saw her sitting at the table in the dark, and he stopped. He wasn't dressed for being seen. Shirt untucked, boots in his hand, the look of a man who had come downstairs for water and not expected company. Sorry, he said. I didn't know you were up. It's fine, she said. I couldn't sleep either. He came in and got himself a glass of water and didn't leave, which she took to mean he didn't particularly want to go back upstairs and sit in the dark alone. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down in it, which was becoming, she realized, just what they did. Sat across from each other at this table when the day got too heavy to carry lying down. I wrote to my father, she said. James set down his glass. About Ferris? Yes, about everything. She looked at the letter by the door. I should have written it sooner. I've been managing distance, keeping the letters safe. She paused. My father is not a bad man. He's just a man who spent years trying to protect people by keeping them at the edge of the truth, and he hasn't figured out yet that the edge of the truth is where people get hurt. James was quiet. I did the same thing, she said, for a long time, before I came here. She wasn't sure why she was saying this. The hour was late and the kitchen was dark, and the letter was sitting by the door with everything exposed in it, and maybe that made honesty feel more available than it usually did. I carried things alone because I thought that was the only way to carry them. Like if I let someone else help hold it, that meant I wasn't strong enough. I know something about that, James said. I know you do, she said. I've watched you do it for a month. He looked at her. Am I that obvious? Only to someone doing the same thing, she said. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the wind had come up. November wind, the kind with teeth in it, moving around the corners of the house with a sound like it was looking for a way in. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals. My father died when I was 22, James said. He said it without preamble, the way he said things when he had decided to say them. No build-up, no softening, just the fact, offered plainly. He'd been sick for 2 years, but I didn't know how bad it was because he didn't tell me. He kept the ranch going on his own, as long as he could, and by the time I understood what was happening, there was no time left to... He stopped. Clara waited. There was no time, he said again. He died with things unsaid that I needed to hear, and he thought he was protecting me by not saying them, and what he actually did was leave me in a house alone with an operation I didn't fully understand yet, and no one to ask. He looked at his glass. I decided after that, I'd never ask anyone for anything. If that was what needing people looked like, I'd rather not need them. Clara thought about the ledger, the Henderson family, the school fund, a man who had spent 10 years giving quietly and systematically to everyone around him while deciding he needed nothing in return. James, she said. He looked up. That's not strength, she said. I'm not saying it to be cruel. I'm saying it because I believed the same thing about myself until about 6 weeks ago, and I'm starting to understand that I was wrong. He held her gaze. What changed 6 weeks ago? I came to Carter Ranch, and a man told me the step was broken and left biscuits on the table and then told me I could leave, and I couldn't figure him out. She said it simply, without drama. I couldn't figure out why someone would do all that and not want something for it, and I've been trying to figure it out ever since. The silence that followed was a different kind of quiet than the silence that had existed between them before. Not the absence of something, more like the presence of something that neither of them had said yet, and both of them knew was there. Have you figured it out? James said. His voice was a little lower than usual. Getting closer, Clara said. 3 days later, the storm came in. She felt it the way you feel weather at altitude before it arrives, in the drop of the air, in the way the light went flat and strange in the early afternoon, in the way the horses in the south pasture started moving without being driven, their instincts older and more honest than any forecast. Silas came to the kitchen door at 2 in the afternoon. Coming in from the northwest, he said. Going to be bad. James is moving the cattle back from the south field before it hits. How long? Clara asked. Hour. Maybe less. She looked out the window at the sky. Fine. That particular dark that isn't rain dark, but something heavier, the sky getting its full weight in before the drop. The south pasture's the farthest point, she said. Yes, Silas said. How many head are out there? James went out with Dex to move them. About 40 head still on the south side of the creek. She did the math in her head. The creek ran faster in bad weather. The crossing near the south fence was shallow in dry conditions, but an early winter storm could bring it up fast, especially with snowmelt from the higher ground coming down. 40 head of cattle on the wrong side of a rising creek, 1 man and a young hand, and a storm an hour out. I'm going out there, she said. Silas looked at her. Clara. Get me a horse, she said. He hesitated for exactly 3 seconds. She counted, and then he nodded and went to the barn. What? She found them at the South Creek crossing, and the creek was already higher than it should have been. The storm had come in faster than Silas had predicted, the way Montana storms do when they decide to stop waiting. a hard wall of wind and driving snow that cut visibility down to 100 yards and made the temperature drop fast enough that she felt it through her coat in the first 10 minutes on horseback. Dex was on the far bank with most of the cattle, trying to push them across. They weren't moving. 40 head of cattle in a storm are 40 individual opinions about whether moving is a good idea, and those opinions do not align easily. Dex was working too hard and too fast, which was making them nervous, which was making them dig in. James was in the creek itself, not across it, not on the bank. In it. His horse had slipped near the crossing. She could see from the way the animal was standing, legs splayed and shaking, and James was on foot in the water up to his thigh, trying to get his horse moving and trying to keep the cattle from scattering at the same time. Clara read the scene in about 4 seconds. She angled her horse along the near bank to the calmer stretch upstream from the crossing, dismounted, tied the horse, and then came along the bank to where James was in the water. James! She had to raise her voice over the wind. He turned. His face was tight with cold and something that might have been pain. She couldn't tell from here. Clara, get back, the creek's... How bad is your leg? She said. He looked at her for a moment. I'm fine. I didn't ask if you were fine. I asked how bad your leg is. A beat. Twisted when the horse slipped. I can stand on it. Standing on it and riding on it are different things, she said. She assessed the crossing. The cattle were the problem. The horse wouldn't move through the herd without a clear path, and Dex couldn't create one from across the bank alone. Tell Dex to stop pushing, pull back, give them room. They'll cross if we stop making it feel like a trap. James turned toward Dex and signaled. Dex, to his credit, pulled back immediately. Clara moved along the bank to the downstream side of the herd, positioning herself as a quiet barrier rather than a driving force. She didn't yell. She didn't rush. She had watched James with the lame horse for 20 minutes in the barn because he'd chosen patience over force, and she had filed that away in the part of her mind that kept useful information. The cattle felt the changed pressure. The pushing stopped. The space opened. The first one stepped into the creek, and then, because cattle are in some ways simpler than people and will follow a leader even into bad weather, the others followed. It took 11 minutes. James got his horse moving once the herd was across, and he came through the water last, moving slow on his left leg but moving. She was waiting on the bank when he came through. He looked at her. Wet through to the waist, jaw set against the cold, his horse blowing hard beside him. And she looked back at him with the snow coming sideways, and the creek roaring behind them, and the storm fully on them now. You shouldn't have come out here, he said. You needed a second person, she said. Clara! James, the cattle are across, let's go home. He looked at her for a long moment. The storm was loud around them, loud enough that everything had to be shouted or foregone, and maybe that was why what he said next came out the way it did. Stripped of its usual containment, just the raw fact of it. I didn't know anyone was going to come, he said. She heard it under the wind. What it meant. Not just today, not just the creek. The longer thing, the 10-year thing, the I've been running this alone thing. She moved to take his horse's lead because his leg was bad, and she could see it was worse than he was saying because that was the kind of man he was. She kept her voice practical. She kept her hands busy. Well, she said, now you know. She didn't look at him when she said it. She started walking the horses toward the ranch with the storm behind them, and after a moment she heard his uneven footfall joining hers. By the time they reached the barn, she understood something that she had been trying not to understand since the first week, something that had been building with the patience of a creek in bad weather, slow and steady and inevitable, and she was done pretending it wasn't there. She wasn't staying at Carter Ranch because of a contract. She was staying because of him. She didn't say anything about it that night, or the next morning, or the morning after that. The understanding she had arrived at in the barn, quiet and irreversible, like something that has always been there finally stepping into the light, was not the kind of thing she knew how to say out loud yet. She had spent most of her life managing what she felt by keeping it at a useful distance, and this felt too close, too immediate, too much like standing at the edge of something with no way to judge the depth. So she did what she had always done. She worked. James's leg was worse than he'd admitted at the creek, which she had known from the way he moved through the barn that evening, the careful distribution of weight, the slight drag on the left side. She had made him sit at the kitchen table, and she had wrapped it herself. Not asking, just doing, because asking would have given him the opportunity to say it was fine and it was not fine. He sat still for it. He didn't object, which told her more than he probably intended. "It's not broken," she said, pressing along the outside of his ankle. "But you've done something to the tendon. You need to keep off it for at least 3 days." "Can't keep off it for 3 days," he said. "I know that. I said you need to. What you'll actually do is your own business." She wrapped the bandage and secured it and sat back. "Stay off it as much as you can then, and don't ride on it tomorrow." "Clara?" "I'll do the south check-in this morning," she said. "Silas can go with me." He looked at her. She could see him working through the objection, the instinctive resistance of a man who had spent 10 years being the one who handled things, who had built his sense of himself around being the one who didn't need to be covered for. "You don't know the south fence line well enough," he said. "Then I'll learn it tomorrow," she said. "Silas knows it." Another pause. "It'll be cold after the storm." "James," she said, and her voice was patient but final. "I went into that creek with you tonight. I think I can manage a fence check." He looked at her for a long moment. Then something in his face settled. Not happily, not fully, but the way a man settles when he recognizes that the argument he's having is with something larger than the specific words being said. "All right," he said. She cleaned up the bandaging supplies and put them away, and he didn't say anything else that night. But the next morning, before she left with Silas for the south fence, there was a hand-drawn map on the kitchen table. The property lines, the fence posts, the 2 creek crossings, each labeled in James's spare, careful handwriting, with a small note at the bottom. "The east crossing is shallow even after rain. Stick to that one." She folded the map and put it in her coat pocket and didn't let herself feel too much about it. Her father's letter arrived 4 days after she sent hers. She recognized his handwriting on the envelope before she even got back to the house. George Whitmore's letters always looked like the work of a man who had learned to write in a one-room schoolhouse and never entirely trusted the process. The letters large and deliberate, each one as if he was making sure it stayed where he put it. She opened it at the kitchen table while the coffee was heating, and she read it twice. He had not signed Ferris's statement. He had been approached, the same way Garrett had described. A man who showed up at the farm with a document and a story about how signing it would protect Clara, would give her an avenue to leave the marriage if she wanted to, would give her options. Her father had almost believed it. He had held the pen. He had not signed it because Lily had come into the kitchen. Lily, who had apparently taken one look at the man and the paper in her father's face and said, in the specific way of a 17-year-old girl who had been paying attention to more than anyone gave her credit for, "Papa, put the pen down." And George Whitmore, who had made almost every important mistake of the last 11 years in rooms where his daughters weren't present to stop him, had listened to her. He wrote, "I am sorry, Clara, for all of it, and for more than I can put in a letter. I am sorry for the debt, and for not telling you, and for almost making it worse when I was trying to help. Your sister is smarter than both of us, and I am grateful every day for it. Write and tell me what you need. I will not make another decision about your life without asking you first." She sat with the letter for a while. Then she put it in her pocket next to the map of the south fence line and went to tell James. I was in the barn, off his leg as much as a man who couldn't keep off his leg could manage, which meant he was sitting on a hay bale doing the kind of work that could be done sitting, mending tack, cleaning a bridle, the maintenance tasks that accumulated and got pushed aside when there was more pressing work to do. He looked up when she came in. She told him about the letter, about Ferris and the statement and her father's pen and Lily standing in the kitchen doorway. She told it the same way she always told him things, in order, with the facts clean, without making it more or less than it was. When she finished, James set down the bridle. "Your sister stopped him," he said. "My sister stopped him," Clara confirmed. He was quiet for a moment, then, "She sounds like someone worth knowing." "She is," Clara said. "She's infuriating and wonderful in equal measure. She would like this ranch. She would have opinions about everything inside of 24 hours, and half of them would be correct." The corner of his mouth moved, more than it usually did, almost a full smile. She noticed that she was cataloging these, the slight variations in his expressions, filing them the way she filed useful information. She noticed that and did not examine it. "So Holloway doesn't have the statement," James said, getting back to the practical. "Not from my father. Doesn't mean he hasn't found another avenue. She leaned against the barn door frame. But it's one less weapon. Webb needs to know, James said. I'll write to him today. She paused. There's something else I've been thinking about. He waited. The school fund, she said. The Henderson family. The other payments. I found 4 more in the older ledger, going back 8 years. 4 other families you've been helping quietly. She looked at him directly. Holloway's case depends on this valley believing you're a cold, self-interested man who would trap a desperate woman into a marriage for his own benefit. But the valley doesn't know what I know. They've built a story about you out of your silence, and you've let them. I don't talk about what I do because it's not, I know, she said. I know it's not about recognition. But James, right now, your silence is being used against you. Holloway is writing the story of who you are, and you're not writing anything. She pushed off the door frame. Let me write it. He looked at her. What does that mean? It means let me talk to the people you've helped. The Hendersons. Whoever those 4 other families are. Let me ask them to speak. Not about your generosity, not to make you look good, just to tell the truth about what they know about you. Because the truth, in your case, happens to be a very different story than what Holloway is selling. James was quiet for a long time. The barn settled around them, the horses shifting, the wind outside moving around the eaves. They don't owe me anything, he said finally. Those families. I know, Clara said. That's exactly why I think they'll do it. He looked at her, and she watched him work through the resistance to it. The deeply held conviction that asking for anything was a kind of weakness, that being seen helping was less honorable than doing it in the dark. She watched him fight with that, and she didn't push, just let him arrive wherever he was going to arrive. All right, he said. All right, she said. She started to go, and he said her name, and she stopped. The map, he said. This morning. I didn't do that because I thought you needed it. She turned to look at him. He was still sitting on the hay bale, the bridle in his hands, and he was not entirely meeting her eyes. Not from evasion, she had learned to tell the difference, but from the particular difficulty of saying something true out loud that you have not said before. I did it because I didn't want you getting lost, he said. Because I wanted to know you'd come back. Clara stood in the barn doorway with November light at her back and looked at this man who said the fewest necessary words of anyone she'd ever met, and thought about how those few words, when he said them, landed with the weight of things that had taken a long time to be ready to be said. I came back, she said. I know, he said. I checked. She left the barn before she let her face do whatever it was trying to do, and she walked back to the house in the cold and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand pressed flat on the table and thought, You are in serious trouble, Clara Whitmore. And then she thought, Clara Carter. And then she stopped thinking entirely and put the coffee on. She went to see Martha Henderson on a Thursday. Martha Henderson was 43 years old and had the look of a woman who had not wasted time on self-pity because self-pity did not get 4 children fed. She met Clara at the door of a farmhouse that was small and impeccably maintained, the kind of house where every room served multiple purposes and nothing was kept that wasn't useful. And she looked at Clara with the careful assessment of a woman who had learned to read strangers quickly because strangers were sometimes what stood between her family and disaster. Mrs. Carter, she said. Not unwelcoming, just waiting. Mrs. Henderson. I'm sorry to come unannounced. Clara held her hat in her hands. I'm here because I need your help, and I need to be honest with you about what kind of help and why. Martha Henderson looked at her for a long moment. Then she opened the door wider and stepped back. Come in, she said. I'll put water on. At the kitchen table sit, and it occurred to Clara that all the important conversations of the last 2 months had happened at kitchen tables. The kitchen tables were where real life actually lived, she explained. She told Martha about Holloway's plan, about the surveyor and the statement and the county hearing that was likely coming. She told her that Holloway needed the valley to believe James Carter was the kind of man who would use a desperate woman, and that the truth was something different, and that she was looking for people who knew the truth from their own experience and were willing to say so. Martha listened without interrupting. She wrapped her hands around her cup and listened. My husband worked for James for 6 years, she said, when Clara finished. He respected him more than any man he'd worked for. Said James was the kind of boss who treated you like you had a brain and used it accordingly. She paused. After Robert died, I didn't know how we'd get through the first winter. Thomas wasn't in school. We couldn't afford the fees. The youngest was sick, and I couldn't pay the doctor. She looked at Clara. James paid the doctor's bill without being asked and without telling me until after he'd done it. He arranged the school fees through the county fund so I wouldn't have to feel like I was accepting charity. He didn't come by every week to check how we were getting on and let me know he'd helped. He just did it and then got out of the way and let me keep my dignity. Clara thought about that last part. Got out of the way and let me keep my dignity. She thought about all the ways a person could give help and how most people, even well-meaning ones, found ways to make the recipient feel the debt. The way James had arranged the school fund so the families receiving it didn't have to know exactly where it came from. The way he'd paid the doctor and then mentioned it afterward as though it were already settled, nothing to discuss. "I'll come to the hearing," Martha Henderson said. "If there is one. Whatever you need me to say, I'll say, as long as it's true. And all of it will be." Clara drove back to Carter Ranch in the thin November light and thought about what she was building. Not just the evidentiary case for the county council, but something else, something that had been forming slowly and was now taking shape. A picture of a man that the town had never seen because he'd never let them look. Not because he was hiding anything, but because showing it had never felt safe. She understood that. She understood it the way you understand something in another person when you found its exact shape inside yourself. Holloway filed with the county council on a Monday. Webb sent word by Ryder, which meant it was serious enough that he didn't trust the post. Clara read the filing summary at the kitchen table with James and Marcus Webb, who had ridden out himself with the documents. The claim was threefold. First, a challenge to the water rights based on a competing survey, the one from Holloway's hired men, the ones Clara had turned away from the South Field. Second, a petition to review the marriage agreement on grounds of potential coercion, supported, the filing claimed, by statements from parties with direct knowledge of the circumstances. And third, and this was the one that made Clara's hands go still on the paper, a challenge to James's fitness to hold water rights in the valley at all, on the grounds of what the filing called irregular financial practices, which appeared to refer to the community assistance payments in the ledger. He had turned James's decency into evidence of impropriety. He had looked at a man who had been quietly helping people for 8 years and found a way to make it look like something to be suspicious of. "He got someone to look at the accounts," James said. His voice was flat. "Someone with access to county tax filings," Webb said grimly. "The payments are visible if you know where to look. He's framing them as undisclosed financial transfers. It won't hold up under examination, but it doesn't need to hold up. It just needs to create uncertainty." "The hearing date," Clara said. 3 weeks, Webb said. "December 14th, County Council Chambers in Red Willow." 3 weeks. Clara looked at the filing and then she looked at James and she thought about everything she knew about Holloway's case. The competing survey, the coercion claim without her father's statement, the account irregularities, and she mapped it against what they had and what they still needed. "The survey is the weakest part of his claim," she said. "Your documentation is solid, and Webb's pre-filing undercuts the competing survey before it's even presented. He knows that. The survey is noise, designed to take up time and create confusion." "Agreed," Webb said. "The coercion claim without my father's statement is also thin. It's speculation without a primary witness, but speculation with the right audience still does damage." She paused. "The account irregularities are the piece he's most confident about, because it's the piece most people in this valley won't understand without explanation. He's counting on it looking worse than it is before anyone has time to look closely." "So we explain it first," James said. He was watching her the way he'd watched her that first evening with the ledger, with the attention of a man who had recognized that someone else could see things he was too close to see himself. "We explain it first," she confirmed. "And we don't just explain it in the chamber. We explain it in Red Willow, beforehand, to the people who will be in that room and the people who will talk to those people." She turned to Webb. "Can we request a public meeting before the hearing? Not a legal proceeding, just a town meeting. People have a right to know what Holloway is actually doing here and what it means for every ranch in the valley if he gets those water rights." Webb considered this. "It's unusual. So is a 13-year campaign to steal a man's water source by manufacturing a scandal out of his marriage," Clara said. Webb almost smiled. "I can make the arrangements." James didn't sleep well in the days after the filing. She could hear it. The careful quiet of a man who wasn't moving but wasn't resting. The kind of stillness that has too much thought in it. She didn't mention it. She had learned not to press him toward things he wasn't ready to say, because he always arrived there eventually, and pressing only made him retreat. He came to her on a Wednesday evening, after supper, when she was going through the hearing documentation at the desk in the back room. He knocked on the open door, which he hadn't done before. "Come in," she said. He came in and stood, which meant he hadn't decided yet whether this was a long conversation or a short one. "I've been thinking about what you said," he started, "about the picture, about letting people see something true." He stopped. She set down her pen. "And?" "I've been thinking that I've spent 10 years making sure nobody needed to worry about me, about what I was doing or what I needed or whether I was all right." He looked at the window. "I thought that was the same as being strong. I thought those were the same thing." "They're not," Clara said. "No," he said. "I can see that now." He looked at her. "You came into the creek." "I did." "You didn't have to." "James, I know what you're going to say," he said, "that it was practical, that there needed to be a second person and you were available and you'd assessed the situation and made a decision." He paused. "That's not why you came." The room was very quiet. "No," she said. "It's not." He crossed the room, not quickly, and sat down in the chair across from her desk. The same chair she'd found the first week, covered in her things, which she had never reclaimed because James had started leaving things on it himself, and she hadn't wanted to disrupt the habit. "I'm afraid," he said, "of being something that you're carrying, something that's adding to what you already—" "James?" Her voice was quiet but firm. "You told me you were tired 3 months ago, on the first day, in the kitchen. You told me you'd been running this alone for 10 years and you were tired. And I thought about that for a long time because I didn't understand why you'd say it to a stranger." He waited. "But you said it because it was the truest thing," she said. "Because you'd been not saying it for so long it finally just came out. And I've been—" She stopped and then made herself continue because she was done managing distance. "I've been falling in love with you slowly, since about the second week. And I've been refusing to look at it directly because I came here on a contract, and I didn't trust that what I felt was real, and not just proximity or gratitude or something I'd built out of needing this to be all right." James was very still. "But I went into that creek because you were in it," she said, "and that's the truest thing I can tell you." He looked at her across the desk, across this kitchen table that wasn't a kitchen table but served the same purpose, the place where the real things got said. And she watched something in him let go. Not collapse. Let go. The way a fist unclenches when it finally trusts that what it was holding won't fall. "I don't know how to do this," he said. "I want to be honest about that. I don't know how to let someone—" "I know," she said. "I'm not asking you to know. I'm just asking you to not decide in advance that it's going to go wrong." He reached across the desk and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over so that her palm was against his. And they sat like that for a while with the lamp burning and the document spread between them and the case against them being built 3 towns over. "I love you," he said. "Not because of the hearing or the accounts or the creek. Before all of that, somewhere. I don't know exactly when." "I know when for me," she said. "When?" "The horse," she said. "The lame mare. You spent 20 minutes because you chose patience over force. And I went back inside and made breakfast and told myself it didn't mean anything." He looked at her. "It took a horse." "It took the right person doing the right thing when no one was watching," she said. "That's what it always takes, for me." The town meeting was set for the Friday before the hearing. Webb arranged it through the county clerk, a public information session, he called it, regarding a pending water rights claim affecting multiple landholders in the valley. That framing was deliberate. It meant every rancher with land near Ridge Creek had a personal reason to show up, which meant the audience would be people who understood what was actually at stake. Clara spent 3 days preparing. Not preparing what to say. She knew what to say, had known since the night she'd written the letter to her father, but preparing how to say it in a room full of people who had built a story about her marriage out of whispers and half-information, people who had decided what kind of woman she was and what kind of man James Carter was before either of them had a chance to speak for themselves. She talked to Martha Henderson again. She talked to a man named Doyle, who turned out to be one of the 4 names in the old ledger. a rancher who had been quietly helped through a bad year 7 years ago and had never told anyone because James had asked him not to. She talked to two more, and in each conversation she heard the same things: quiet, without ceremony, out of the way, let me keep my dignity. Dex, of all people, came to her the night before the meeting. He appeared at the kitchen door with his hat in his hands and a look of someone who had been working up to something and had finally gotten there. "I want to say something tomorrow," he said. "At the meeting, if that's all right." She looked at him. He was 20 years old and nervous and completely sincere. "What would you say?" "That James gave me this job when nobody else would," Dex said. "When I came here, I didn't know anything. Most ranchers would have sent me back down the road. He kept me on and taught me, and never once made me feel stupid for not knowing." He twisted his hat. "I know that's not the same as the legal stuff, but I thought people should know what kind of man he is." Clara looked at this young man standing in the doorway and thought about the story Holloway was telling: cold, ruthless, calculating, and thought about the actual human texture of James Carter's life as lived by the people inside it. "Come tomorrow," she said. "Say exactly that." She went to find James afterward and she told him about Dex. He was quiet for a moment. "He doesn't need to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's why it matters." The night before the meeting, she couldn't sleep. Not from fear, exactly. The fear she'd felt in the early days, the contracted, managed fear of a woman trying to survive an impossible situation, had been replaced by something different, something that had more motion to it, more at stake, in a different way. She got up and came to the kitchen and found, predictably, that James was already there. He was at the table with a cup of coffee going cold in his hand, staring at a middle distance that didn't have anything specific in it. He looked up when she came in. "Can't sleep," she said. "No," he said. She poured herself coffee and sat across from him. The stove had been stoked recently, which meant he'd been up for a while. "They're going to look at us tomorrow," she said. "The whole town. They're going to look at how we sit and how we talk to each other, and they're going to decide whether what Holloway is saying could possibly be true." "I know," James said. "I'm not afraid of that," she said. "I just want you to know that. I'm not afraid of them looking." He looked at her across the table. "Neither am I," he said. "Not anymore." She thought about what he'd said. Not anymore. And what that meant about what he had been afraid of before. And she thought about the slow and irreversible way that two people could change each other just by being honest in the same room often enough. Outside, the November night was cold and clear, the kind of cold that made the stars very bright and the distance between them very apparent. Tomorrow, the town of Red Willow would look at them and make a judgment. Holloway would push whatever he had left to push. And Clara Whitmore, Clara Carter, would stand up and tell the truth, which was the only thing she had always had that no one could manufacture or challenge or steal. She reached across the table and turned the lamp down just enough that the room went soft and warm, and they sat together in the quiet of the house they had built into a home and waited for morning. Morning came the way difficult mornings always do, too fast and too bright, the kind of clear November light that doesn't soften anything. Clara was dressed before James came downstairs. She had been up for an hour already, sitting at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold, going through the sequence of the day in her mind the way she went through the ledger columns, methodically, checking each thing, making sure she hadn't missed something that would matter later. She had done everything she could do in the time she'd had. She had talked to Martha Henderson and Doyle and the other families. She had worked through the documentation with Webb until she could recite the water rights history from memory. She had written out what she intended to say and then thrown the paper away, because what she intended to say needed to come from her directly, not from notes, not from anything that could be made to look rehearsed. James came into the kitchen and looked at her sitting there and read whatever was on her face. "You're ready," he said. Not a question. "I'm ready," she said. He poured his coffee and sat down, and they ate breakfast without talking much, the way people eat when the talking is for later, and right now the quiet is what holds everything in place. She noticed he'd put on his good shirt, the dark one, the one he wore to Webb's office. She noticed he'd shaved. She noticed these things and filed them under the growing catalog of what James Carter looked like when something mattered to him. They drove into Red Willow together in the wagon, Silas sitting in the back, because he had decided without being invited that he was coming, and nobody had argued. The town appeared on the horizon in the thin winter light, and Clara watched it take shape, the buildings, the water tower, the steeple of the church, and thought about how this town had built a story about her marriage in the weeks before she'd arrived, how that story had been running on its own momentum ever since, fed by Holloway, and by the natural human appetite for a narrative that explained things. Today, she was going to give them a different story, a true one. The town hall was already half full when they arrived, which told her the meeting had spread farther than the county clerk's official notice. People had talked. People had called their neighbors. The valley's ranchers were there. She recognized some of them from the general store, from May's descriptions, from the names in Webb's correspondence. There were townspeople, too, storekeepers and their wives, a few people she didn't know at all. Holloway was there. He was sitting near the front on the left side, flanked by two men she didn't recognize, the kind of men who sit beside someone powerful in a public setting to demonstrate that the power is real. He didn't acknowledge James and Clara when they came in. He looked at his hands. That told her something. A man who was confident in his position would have looked at them. Holloway wasn't looking because he'd already been calculating, and some part of the calculation wasn't coming up the way he'd expected. Webb was at the front of the room, organizing papers at the table that had been set up for the purpose. He looked up when they came in and gave Clara a small nod that meant he was ready. May Reardon was in the third row with Cal beside her. She caught Clara's eye and did something with her expression that wasn't quite a smile but communicated clearly. "We're here. We've got you." Martha Henderson was near the back, Thomas beside her, the 8-year-old who was good at arithmetic, sitting very straight with his good jacket on. Clara hadn't expected Martha to bring him. When she caught Martha's eye, Martha gave a small lift of her chin. Clara understood. The boy was not a prop. He was just a fact. A living, present, undeniable fact. Dex was standing along the wall, still with his hat in his hands, still vibrating with the specific nervous energy of someone who is committed to something brave and is now waiting to find out what brave actually costs. Clara and James took seats near Webb's table and waited for the room to fill. Webb opened the meeting with the legal context. The pending water rights challenge, the timeline of events, the nature of the county council's authority. He was precise and unhurried, which was the right register. This was not a drama. It was a set of facts that the community deserved to understand. Then he gave the floor to Clara. She stood up, and the room went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when they have been waiting for something and it is finally happening. She had thought about how to begin this. She had considered starting with the water rights, with the documentation, with the legal specifics that were the official reason for the meeting. She had decided against it. Not because the legal specifics weren't important, they were, but because the room was full of human beings, and human beings do not lead with documents. They lead with what they understand from their own lives. So she started with the truth. "My name is Clara Carter," she said. "Before I came to this valley, I was Clara Whitmore, and most of you have probably heard a version of my story. My family was in debt. There was a marriage arrangement. I signed a paper and came to Carter Ranch." She let that sit for a moment. "What you probably haven't heard is what happened the first day I arrived." She spoke clearly, without rushing. "James Carter told me the debt was settled, and I could leave whenever I wanted. He told me I wasn't there as a debt. He told me, and I'm saying his exact words because they mattered then and they matter now, that he wasn't going to hold a piece of paper over my head like a leash." She heard the room shift. Not dramatically, just the small movement of people adjusting their understanding. "I stayed," she said, "not because I had to, because I made a choice. And in the months I've been at Carter Ranch, I have come to understand something about the man this town has been calling cold and difficult and impossible to read." She paused. "You built that story out of his silence. He's quiet, and you filled the quiet with what you assumed. I know something about that because I spent my whole life doing the same thing, staying quiet and letting people assume because it felt safer than being known." She saw James in her peripheral vision. She did not look at him directly because she needed to stay in the room, needed to hold the whole room, but she felt him there. "What I actually found at Carter Ranch," she continued, "was a man who has been quietly helping this valley for 8 years. Not announcing it, not asking for recognition, paying doctors' bills and school fees and keeping families on their land through bad years without making anyone feel the weight of it." She let that land. "And what Richard Holloway has done, what this challenge before the county council is actually about, is take that record of quiet decency and try to make it look like something suspicious. Because if he can make James Carter look like a man capable of trapping a desperate woman, he can make the council question whether James is fit to hold the water rights that protect every ranch in this valley. She turned slightly, enough to address the room rather than just the front of it. "Those water rights matter to you," she said. "All of you with land near Ridge Creek. If Holloway gets control of that water source, he sets the terms. He sets the price. And if you can't pay his price, or if he simply decides your land is more useful to him than your presence on it, you know what happens next. You've seen it happen in other parts of the state, and you know exactly what it looks like." The room was very still. "I'm not here to ask you to take my word for anything," she said. "I'm here to tell you the truth about my marriage and about the man I married, and to let the people of this valley who know that truth from their own lives speak for themselves." She sat down. Martha Henderson stood up. She didn't have notes. She didn't need them. She talked about her husband and about the winter after he died and about a doctor's bill that had been settled before she knew it had been submitted. She talked about Thomas and the school fees, about how the money had come through a county fund in a way that led her believe for a whole year that it was an official program before she'd understood that James Carter had set it up himself. She talked about it plainly, without emotion manipulation, which made it more powerful than if she'd cried. When she sat down, Thomas, who had not been asked to speak and had not told anyone he was going to, stood up beside her. He was 8 years old. He was small for it. He said, in a clear voice that carried to the back of the room, "Mr. Carter paid for my school. I'm going to be an engineer. I thought people should know that." Then he sat down. The room was absolutely silent for 3 full seconds. Clara heard someone in the third row make a sound that was quickly suppressed. She did not look at James. She was afraid of what she would see on his face, and she needed to stay composed. Doyle spoke next. Then a woman named Ruth Sayers that Clara hadn't known about. Webb had found her the previous week, a widow from the east side of the valley whose name Clara had found in the old ledger under an entry that simply said, "Winter Assistance, Sayers Family." Ruth was in her 60s and small, and she had the dignity of someone who has survived things she didn't choose to survive, and she told the room about a winter 12 years ago, when she had not known how she would keep her children warm, and a cord of wood had appeared on her porch from an unsigned delivery, and how she'd known even then who it was from, because there was only one person in the valley who did things like that, and didn't attach his name to them. Then Dex spoke. He was shaking slightly when he stood up, visibly, his hat crushed in both hands. He said what he had said to Clara at the kitchen door, that James had kept him on when nobody else would, had taught him without making him feel stupid for not knowing. He added one thing Clara hadn't heard before. "My father left when I was 12. I didn't have anybody show me how a man was supposed to work and treat people. James Carter showed me that. I didn't ask him to, and he didn't make a thing out of doing it. He just did it." He sat down fast, like he was worried about what his face might do next. Webb stood up after Dex and presented the water rights documentation, the 1887 survey, the 1901 confirmation, the 1903 water lease amendment. He walked through it clearly, the way he'd walked through it with Clara and James, and he explained what Holloway's competing survey had actually found, which was nothing, because the boundary line was exactly where it had always been, and the competing survey's own methodology was internally inconsistent in 3 places that Webb identified by page number. Holloway stood up when Webb finished. The room watched him. He had the look of a man who has arrived at a moment he planned for extensively and is discovering that the terrain has shifted underneath his plan. He was still composed. He was too experienced not to be. But the composure had a tightness to it now, the look of something being held in place by effort. "The financial transfers in the Carter Ranch accounts remain unexplained by county standards," he said. "Whatever personal narrative has been presented today, the legal question of irregular financial practices. The transfers are fully documented in the ranch ledger and available for county review," Webb said pleasantly. "They represent charitable support to Valley residents, funded from operating profits and managed through a restructured line of credit that was reported to the county bank last month. I can provide the documentation to the council today if they'd like to review it." A pause. "The coercion claim," Holloway tried. "Requires a primary witness," Webb said. "The statement you attempted to obtain from Mr. George Whitmore was declined. The secondary statement from a notarized source was also declined. You have, by my reading of your filing, no signed witness testimony supporting the coercion claim." He tilted his head slightly. I could be wrong about that. If you have documentation I haven't seen, this would be the time to present it. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room completely, the kind where everyone present understands what is happening and is holding very still so as not to disturb it. Holloway said nothing. Clara heard someone cough near the back of the room. She heard a chair scrape. She kept her eyes forward and her hands still in her lap. The council will review the documentation and issue a ruling within 30 days, said the county clerk, who had been sitting at a side table throughout and now spoke with the carefully neutral tone of a man who had watched the balance of the room shift entirely and was noting the result without commenting on it. The preemptive filing by Mr. Webb's office has been received and logged. All parties will be notified. Holloway sat down. He sat down the way someone sits when the choice is between sitting down and something worse, and he did not look at anyone as he did it. Outside afterward, in the cold air of the Red Willow Street, people came to them. Not everyone. Some people left quickly, which was fine. A room full of people reconsidering what they thought they knew takes time to metabolize, and some of them would need to go home and sit with it before they knew how they felt. But enough people came. May Reardon, who hugged Clara in the straightforward way she did everything and said, "That was exactly right," into her ear before pulling back. Silas, who shook James's hand and said nothing, because Silas never said things when a handshake covered it. A rancher she didn't know who introduced himself as Amos Pollard and told James that he'd been waiting for someone to say that about Holloway in a public room for the better part of a decade and was glad it had finally happened. Martha Henderson came out with Thomas. Thomas had his hands in his pockets and looked at James with the direct, uncomplicated gaze of an 8-year-old who had decided to say a true thing in a room full of adults and was satisfied with how it had gone. "Thank you for coming," James said to Martha. "Thank you for letting us," Martha said. She looked at him the way people look at someone they've owed a debt to that can't be paid in currency. "The cord of wood the first winter," she said. "I never said anything because I thought you'd want it that way. But I've been wanting to say thank you for 6 years. James looked at her. "It was cold," he said. "It needed doing." Martha shook her head, not in disagreement, but in the recognition that this was exactly what she'd expected him to say, and that it was exactly wrong and exactly right at the same time. She put her hand briefly on his arm, and then she and Thomas walked back toward their wagon. Clara watched James watch them go. She watched something in his face, not break, not that, but ease. The particular easing of a man who has spent years carrying something in a specific posture and has been allowed, finally, to set it down and stand up straight. She said nothing. Some moments don't need commentary. They just need to be stood in. What? The council's ruling came on December 22nd, 3 days before Christmas. Webb rode out with it himself, which she had come to recognize as his way of indicating that the news was either very good or very bad, and by the time he came through the gate, she had already read his face and knew which it was. The competing survey was rejected. The boundary documentation was affirmed. The water rights remained with Carter Ranch, undisturbed, as they had been for 41 years. The coercion claim was dismissed for lack of evidentiary support. The financial practices review found no irregularities. The charitable transfers, now fully documented and explained, were noted in the ruling as evidence of a landowner in good standing with the community. Holloway's attempt to challenge Carter Ranch's position in the valley was, in the council's phrasing, without merit and without foundation. Without merit and without foundation. Clara read that line twice. Webb stayed for coffee and to go through the details of the ruling, and when he left, he shook both their hands and looked at Clara over his glasses with the expression of a man who had been practicing law for 30 years and knew when he'd been in the presence of something that mattered. "You changed the conversation," he told her. "Before you stood up in that room, Holloway had a story. After you sat down, he just had documents. And documents without a story behind them are a lot easier to defeat." After he left, the ranch went quiet in the way it goes quiet at the end of a long, serious day. Silas and the hands finished their work, and the barn went dark, and the house settled into the evening. Clara stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking out at the yard and the fence line and the dark line of the hills beyond, and she thought about the last 4 months, from the paper on the table in her father's kitchen to this window, this house, this life that had grown up around her while she was busy surviving it. She heard James come in behind her. He didn't say anything, just stood in the kitchen doorway the way he had that first night, but differently. Less careful now, less contained, the way a man stands in his own house when he trusts what he finds there. "It's over," she said. "It is," he said. She turned around. He was looking at her with the expression she had first seen in the barn that November morning, the window that surprised itself by opening, except that now it wasn't surprising. Now it was just how he looked at her, openly, without the careful distance that had been the first version of him. "I've been thinking about something," she said. "What?" "That contract." She held his gaze. "The original agreement. I've been thinking that I want to write a different one." He looked at her. "What kind?" "Not one that anyone else wrote. Not one that was designed to settle a debt or solve a problem." She paused. "One that says what's actually true. That I choose to be here. That I'm not here because of a ledger or a drought or a desperate morning in my father's kitchen. That I'm here because of you, specifically, and because this is where I want to be." James crossed the kitchen. He stopped in front of her, close, and she had to look up slightly because he was taller, which she had noted the very first day and filed away in the part of her mind where she kept things she wasn't ready to think about yet. "We don't need a contract for that," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the point." He put his hand against her face, careful and a little uncertain in the way he was when he was doing something he didn't have practice at, and she put her hand over his and held it there. "I love you," he said. "I keep saying it because I spent a long time not saying things, and I'm trying to correct that." "Keep correcting it," she said. Lily came for Christmas. She arrived on the 24th in a wagon driven by a neighboring farmer's son who had been persuaded to make the trip, wrapped in 3 layers and carrying a basket from their mother that contained the choke cherry preserves and a fruitcake and a letter from George Whitmore that Clara read in private and then folded and put in the drawer of the desk in the back room where she kept the things that mattered. Lily walked into Carter Ranch the way she walked into everything, with total attention, looking at everything, cataloging, forming opinions. She looked at the house and the yard and Silas and the horses. She looked at James with the particular scrutiny of a younger sister who has been worrying about her older sister for months and is now assessing whether the worry was warranted. James endured the scrutiny with characteristic stillness. Then Lily looked at Clara. Really looked, the way sisters look at each other when they are seeing past the surface to whatever is actually there. And her expression changed. The worry went out of it. Something else came in, something that might have been relief and might have been wonder. The look of someone who has been hoping for a particular outcome and is now finding it in front of them. "You're happy," Lily said. Like it surprised her. "I am," Clara said. Lily looked at James again. He looked back at her, patient and direct, in the way he always looked at things he was trying to understand. "You fixed the step," Lily said. James glanced at the front step, which he had fixed in the first week and repaired once more since then when the November frost had worked the board loose. "First day," he said. Lily looked at Clara. Clara looked at the floor because she was smiling, and Lily didn't need the satisfaction. "I want to see the horses," Lily announced, which was her way of saying she needed a minute to adjust to the fact that things had turned out all right, that the disaster she'd been dreading hadn't arrived, that her sister was standing in this yard with color in her cheeks and something in her eyes that Lily had not seen in a very long time. James walked her to the barn, pointing things out as they went, and Clara heard Lily's voice asking questions and James answering them in the patient, plain way he answered everything, and she stood in the yard in the cold December air and thought about how quiet it had been before she arrived here, how completely this ranch had been a place where one person managed everything alone because he decided that was what strength required. She thought about her own kitchen table at home, the paper, the pen, the trembling hands. She thought about the distance between that moment and this one. Not the distance in miles, though it was real, but the distance in understanding. How much she had not known about herself or about what was possible, how completely she had contracted around the idea of surviving rather than living. There are moments in a life when you realize the thing you thought was an ending was actually a turning point, not a gift from anywhere, just the particular convergence of necessity and character, of what you were forced into and who you turned out to be inside the forcing. Clara hadn't been saved by this. She had saved herself, over and over, in small daily decisions that accumulated into something she hadn't planned. But she hadn't done it alone. That was what she hadn't known was possible. That was what she knew now. Spring came late to Carter Ranch, the way spring always comes late in that part of Montana, grudging, incremental, a little bit at a time until one morning you step outside and the quality of the air is different and the ground has given up its frost and the hills have started going green at the lower elevations. The cattle numbers were up. The accounts were solid, more than solid actually, because the restructured line of credit had allowed them to expand the south herd without drawing down the operating reserve, and Clara had found 2 more places in the quarterly expenses where they were paying more than necessary and corrected them. Webb had written in February with the news that Holloway had sold his eastern parcel and was making motions to consolidate his holdings elsewhere in the county, which was the particular retreat of a man who has recognized that his campaign has failed but will never say so out loud. The Henderson boy, Thomas, came to the ranch on a Saturday in April with his mother and a drawing he'd made in school, a careful rendering of a creek and a fence line, labeled in his best 8-year-old handwriting, Ridge Creek, Carter Ranch. He presented it to James with the gravity of someone giving a significant gift, which it was. James looked at it for a long moment. Then he took it inside and put it on the desk in the back room, which Clara noted without saying anything, in the way she noted most things about him now, with the particular attention of someone who loves what they're watching. On a Saturday evening in late April, Clara wrote a letter to her father. She wrote about the spring, about the ranch and the accounts, and the way the south pasture looked now that the creek had returned to its normal level. She wrote about Lily's visit and what it had meant. She wrote, carefully and honestly, about James, not performing happiness, not managing the distance anymore, just telling the truth about who he was and what they had built, and how none of it was perfect, and how it didn't need to be. She wrote, "You asked me once to save the family. I don't think that was the right thing to ask, and I think you know that now. But what happened because of it turned out to be the truest thing in my life, and I've been sitting with the strange arithmetic of that for months. The worst moment of my life opened a door I didn't know existed. I'm not grateful for the debt or the desperation or the paper on the table, but I'm grateful for what's on the other side of that door, Papa. I'm very grateful for that." She sealed the letter and left it by the door to go out with the morning post. James was on the porch when she came out, standing at the rail the way he stood when he was thinking, looking out at the yard and the fence line and the hills going green in the evening light. She stood beside him, and he made room for her without being asked. "Letter to your father?" he said. "Yes." "Good things?" "Mostly," she said. "True things." He put his arm around her, the easy way of 2 people who have gotten past the careful distances and arrived somewhere solid, and she leaned into him and looked out at Carter Ranch in the April evening, the barn and the yard and the south fence line and the hills and the creek running clear and steady beyond the pasture. The ranch had been here before either of them. It would likely be here after. But what it was now, what it had become in one season, in one impossible and unlikely year, was something different from what it had been before. It had been a place one man managed alone because he'd convinced himself that was the only honest way to hold something. Now it was a home. Not because it looked different, not because the problems were gone or the work was lighter or the future was certain, because none of those things were true. Ranching was hard and Montana was harsh, and people like Holloway would always exist somewhere in the landscape, patient and circling. But there were 2 people standing on this porch instead of one. And that, the simple, irreducible, hard-won fact of that, was everything. Clara looked out at the hills and thought about the girl who had signed her name on a kitchen table with a steady hand and a silent promise to survive but never give her heart away. She thought, "You were brave, you were right to be careful, and you were wrong about what was possible." The evening settled around them, warm enough now that the cold didn't reach through, and the light went gold and long across the pasture, and somewhere in the barn, one of the horses moved and made a sound like something exhaling all at once. James Carter had spent years building land that no one could take from him. What he hadn't known, what neither of them had known, was that the things worth keeping aren't the ones you build walls around. They're the ones you let in.